The bizarre economics of America's smallest banks. Drive across America and something strange stands out. Every town looks the same. Same CVS, same AutoZone, same Walmart. The local pharmacy, the family grocery store, the neighborhood bookshop. They've mostly been replaced by identical chains with identical layouts. But there's one category of business that somehow survived this flattening, small, family-run, small-town banks, thousands of them. And once you actually look at the numbers behind how banking works, their survival stops looking quaint. It starts looking almost miraculous. Let's start with the numbers, because they're genuinely wild. The United States has more than 4,000 banks, and no other country comes remotely close. Russia is in second place, with just over 400. The UK has around 300. China has under 200. And that's not counting branches. Total bank branches across the US sit at over 78,000. Now here's where it gets interesting. Under federal law, banks holding more than 10% of the nation's total deposits generally can't grow by buying up competitors. Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and Chase all sit right around that threshold, each holding somewhere between 10% and 16% market share. So legally, they can only grow by opening new branches, not by acquiring existing banks. But here's the thing. That rule only applies to those three giants. 99.9% of banks in America are completely free to gobble up their smaller competitors. And we've watched exactly that kind of consolidation happen in almost every other industry. Since the 1980s, Walmart alone has wiped out small retail across most of rural America. So why hasn't the same thing happened to banking? Some of it really is just historical accident. Until the 1900s, banks were legally restricted to one single location, no branches at all. Even after that changed, they were generally locked into a single state. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s that banks could finally expand nationwide, which means in the grand scheme of things, they've only had 30 or 40 years to consolidate. That's not a lot of time for an entire industry to reshape itself. But history alone doesn't explain everything because plenty of other industries have consolidated way faster than that. So there has to be something else going on, something structural about how banks actually make money. Let's take a real example. Kentland, Indiana. Population, 1828 people, surrounded on every side by cornfields. Blink on Highway 24 and you'll miss it entirely. And yet, Kentland has its own bank, Kentland Federal Savings and Loan, America's smallest bank with just $3 million in total assets. It's been open since 1920. It survived the Great Depression, and over 100 years later, it still runs entirely on paper. No computers, no ATMs, no fees. Deeds are literally stored in a cardboard box in the back of the building. You can open a savings account with a single $5 bill. And Kentland Federal isn't even the town's only bank. This is a town with one McDonald's, one bar, one gym, and 3 separate banks, plus a drive-up ATM. This pattern shows up everywhere once you start looking. Oakwood, Texas, population 400 has its own bank. Elmore City, Oklahoma, population 600 has 2. And in Bird in Hand, Pennsylvania, a town of just 537 people, the bank will literally come to you. The Bank of Bird in Hand serves its mostly Amish customers with a fleet of buses, plus buggy-friendly parking for horse-drawn carriages. That tiny operation now holds $1.8 billion in assets. Here's the math that makes this genuinely confusing. The average income in a town like Kentland is around $42,000 a year. And in a typical month, the median American bank branch opens just 23 new checking or savings accounts and issues about 5 loans. 23 and 5, that's it. Many of those accounts hold almost nothing. Think an 8-year-old's $20 in tooth fairy money or a college student's $2,500 in part-time job earnings. So how does any of this justify paying for a prime storefront on Main Street, staffed 40 hours a week by full-time employees, let alone 3 separate banks doing that in a town of under 2,000 people? To answer that, we need to actually understand how banks make money in the first place. At the core, it's really simple. Banks buy low and sell high just like any other business. First, they buy your money as cheaply as possible, and the cheapest money in the entire financial system comes from checking accounts. Think about it. Who else hands you cash on payday and only charges you an interest rate of 0.07%? That's essentially a free loan to the bank. Savings accounts are the bank's second favorite source of money. They pay you slightly more for it, But in exchange, they limit how often you can withdraw. That restriction lets them count on that money staying put longer, which means they can lend it out more confidently. And that's the second half of the equation, selling high. Banks take your deposits and lend them out to borrowers at a much higher rate. Right now, the average 30-year mortgage costs around 6.5%. The gap between what a bank pays you for your money and what it earns lending that same money out has a name. It's called the net interest margin. That's just banking jargon for the profit margin on money itself. Do the math. 6.5% minus 0.07% is a massive spread. Multiply that across millions of dollars in deposits, and suddenly, even a tiny bank can keep its lights on. Now, here's the catch for banks. They actually have very little control over either side of that equation, not what they pay depositors, not what they can charge borrowers, especially in a town like Kentland, where 3 different banks are all competing for the exact same customers. So if you can't control your rates, what can you control? Costs. Ruthlessly managing expenses is one of the only real levers a bank has left to pull. This is exactly why. If you walk into a Chase or Wells Fargo branch with a complicated issue, your teller often ends up picking up the phone right in front of you, calling a centralized customer service line. It's far cheaper to maintain one central office of specialists than to staff every single branch with experts on every possible issue. It's also why your bank desperately wants you to switch to paperless statements. Sometimes they'll even dangle a one-time bonus, a couple $100 just to get you to opt in. You might assume mailing a letter costs basically nothing for a company with millions in assets. You'd be wrong. It's one of the few costs a bank can actually reduce, so they chase that savings aggressively. Most of their other big expenses are fixed and non-negotiable, real estate being the obvious one. To attract deposits, a bank needs to be centrally located, ideally right in the middle of a busy downtown block. That means expensive drive-through lanes, pneumatic tubes, ATMs, and a large physical footprint. Here's a fun side effect of this. If you ever need free parking somewhere, look for a bank. Because banks depend so heavily on picking up those 23 new accounts a month, they can't afford to turn away even one walk-in customer, even at 4:30 on a Friday when everyone's rushing in to cash their paycheck, which means they end up building way more parking than they actually need, sitting mostly empty 90% of the week. And remember, most bank branches are tiny. The median branch holds under 3,000 total accounts. If just 30 customers decide to bank somewhere else, that's already a 1% drop in their entire customer base. Now, here's the genuinely ironic part. Banks fight incredibly hard to keep customers who, statistically, will never actually be profitable for them. A lot of businesses accept a small loss on certain products just to get people in the door. But banking is unusual. The median customer generates zero profit, sometimes even a negative return. Picture a typical account holder. They keep around $1,300 sitting in checking, they show up at the ATM twice a month on payday, and they will probably never apply for a mortgage in their life. Now, it's true that banks charge some pretty aggressive fees. On average, a single account generates around $107 a year just in service charges and overdraft fees. That's a steep price just to access your own money. But even with those fees, it still costs the bank far more to service that same average customer, somewhere between $250 and $400 a year, according to some estimates. So the fees don't even come close to covering the real cost. Which raises the obvious question. Why do banks even bother keeping these customers around? 2 reasons. First, most of a bank's costs are fixed regardless of customer count. Real estate and staffing cost roughly the same, whether a branch has 3,100 accounts or 3,200. So the median customer might not be profitable, but they're not catastrophically unprofitable either. Second, and this is the bigger reason, banking is a long game. Most people genuinely hate thinking about switching banks, so once you're in, you tend to stay for life. The average branch collects half of all the deposits it will ever hold within its first 3 years of operation. After that, the whole strategy basically shifts. It becomes about keeping existing customers happy. Here's the trade-off in plain terms. A bank might lose a little money on your checking account for 23 straight years. But if, in year 24, you finally walk in and apply for a mortgage, all of that earlier loss suddenly pays for itself many times over. Think of those first 2 decades of small losses as a long-term marketing investment. Banks need their community's trust to survive long-term, but they also need to slash costs wherever they can. Sponsoring the local Little League team and quietly servicing unprofitable young customers for years are 2 relatively cheap ways banks manage to do both at once. Now, you'd think, given all of this, that banking would be an industry where bigger is always better. After all, spread those fixed costs across more customers, and your average cost per customer drops. The same logic applies to ATM networks. More locations means more convenience for people who travel. And there's real truth to that. Just 3 banks, Chase, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America, together hold nearly half of all deposits in the entire country. But scale isn't free of downsides either. Big banks typically offer one uniform interest rate across every single branch nationwide. That works fine in cities, where customers barely notice the difference between earning 0.03% and 0.3% on their savings. But in rural areas, that tiny difference actually matters because deposits often make up a much bigger share of someone's total wealth out there. The problem for a giant bank is simple. They can't offer rural customers a genuinely competitive rate without cutting into the profits they make from millions of city customers who don't care either way, which creates a strange, almost backwards outcome. The best deposit rates in the country are often found at small, local banks because they can tailor their rates precisely to their own specific community without worrying about a national average. It's one of the rare corners of the economy where being small is actually the advantage. Big banks, meanwhile, play a completely different game. They optimize for what their customers actually care about most: convenience. Better apps, better websites, mobile check deposit, and in dense cities, a branch on practically every corner. That's why New York City has such an absurd concentration of banks. Just within a quarter-mile radius of Midtown Manhattan, there are 50 different bank branches, including 5 separate Chase locations, all within walking distance of each other. There are genuinely more Chase branches across New York's 5 boroughs than there are Starbucks. New Yorkers value convenience that much. Even one extra block matters when you're walking everywhere. Now, here's one more area where small banks quietly have the edge: debit cards. Quick explainer. Every time you swipe a debit card at a store, say Costco, your bank charges Costco a small fee for processing that transaction. Since 2011, federal law has capped that fee at 21 cents plus 0.05% of the purchase amount. That's why almost no debit card offers cashback rewards. 21 cents plus a tiny percentage just doesn't leave enough room to share any of it back with you, the customer. If you want 3% cashback on restaurants, you have to apply for a credit card instead, whether you actually want one or not. But here's where it gets interesting. That 2011 law included a specific exemption. Any bank holding less than $10 billion in total assets was exempt, which means tiny Kentland Federal Savings and Loan could, in theory, offer you 2% cashback on groceries with a simple debit card, something JP Morgan Chase is legally barred from doing. It's a strange, almost backwards moment in American law. A rare case where the rules were specifically written to protect small, local businesses from being crushed by their enormous competitors. And maybe that's the real answer to the mystery here. Part historical accident, part deliberate regulation, part sheer stubborn community loyalty. Somehow, in a country where every strip mall looks identical and every town has the same Dollar General, you can still walk into a small brick building with your town's name on the front, shake hands with the same 67-year-old owner who's run it for decades, and grab a free cookie on your way out.